So, Dr. Florence Ashley is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law and adjunct member of the John Doster Health Ethics Center. As a transdisciplinary trans feminine scholar, Florence researches a diverse range of topics relating to transgender communities, with a particular emphasis on law and clinical ethics. Earlier in their career, Florence served as the first openly trans feminine law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. Their widely published writings have been cited at the Supreme Court of Canada and in international standards of care and in United Nations reports. They are the author of Banning Transgender Conversation Practices, a Legal and Policy Analysis. Without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Ashley. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me. Also, I always feel weird when people call me doctor because it's not a very common practice in law. We like all call each other professor because a lot of my colleagues actually don't. My colleagues less, but a lot of law professors don't have doctorates. Anyway, my presentation today is titled, Do Trans/Humanists Dream of Electric Tits? CRISPR and Transgender Bioethics. And it's based on a book chapter that is going to be coming out shortly. I'm not actually sure on the timeline, but on a book with the Johns Hopkins University Press titled The Promises and Perils of CRISPR. Now, the talk is essentially about a transgender perspective on CRISPR. So what is CRISPR? Well, CRISPR, or CRISPR gene editing more accurately, is essentially a particular technology of gene editing, and one that has garnered quite a lot of media attention as kind of one of the leading forms of gene editing. And part of it is that it's seen as relatively cheap and relatively simple to use, and it can be used to make changes to somatic cells, so kind of the cells that compose our body, or germline cells, which are the ones that we pass on to our descendants when we reproduce. And of course, the debates around the use of CRISPR have varied quite a lot depending on whether we're talking about germline cells and somatic cells. And there's a lot more opposition to the use for germline cells because of this kind of like downstream impact on descendants. Now, how did I get involved in this topic? This is not really my standard area of research because it doesn't directly connect, or it's not the most kind of natural connection to trans community, but the people who are editing the book, who are Neil Baer and Martha Montello at Harvard Med, we're essentially looking for somebody who could provide a trans-specific perspective on the topic. And unfortunately / fortunately for me, there's not a lot of trans bioethicists out there. And so they ended up reaching out, and I decided that, I'd give it a shot and try to see what smart thoughts I could have on the topic. And what I'm going to tell you about is essentially three topics, subtopics. The first one is the potential for CRISPR and the ethics of CRISPR as a form of high-tech conversion practices. Then CRISPR as high-tech medical transition technology. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethics of hype. So my initial reaction to the idea of like using CRISPR in the trans context was one of concern. And you have to understand that like when I came to that topic, I had been really in the midst of working on conversion practices, which are attempts at changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, or preventing them from going up queer or trans. And they're now prohibited in Canada and a few other countries, but they remain quite prevalent. And we are, in fact, seeing what we might describe as a revival of conversion practices in Canada, as well as, in other countries, most notably in Australia, the UK, and the United States, as part of a kind of rise in hostility towards trans communities. And right around when I was writing this, or that I was doing research for this article, there was an article published, I think it was in eNeuro, that essentially suggested that if we're able to identify a biological basis and notably a neurological basis for being trans, then neuroscience might be able to provide some quote unquote solution in order to prevent people from being trans and prevent them from experiencing gender dysphoria. And so there was this idea of using technology towards the suppression of trans existence in society. And that really went in line with the long history of conversion practices, which has tended to jump over new developments in terms of medical technology. Just as much as we've seen very kind of Freudian approaches to conversion practices targeting trans people, we've also seen the uptake of early endocrinology in order to try to correct people's sexual orientation through hormonal means or by doing a surgical graft of testicles and things like that. And then, when there was the rise of behaviorism within psychiatry, then you got a surge in behaviorism as a form of conversion practices. And so there is that kind of potential, at least in theory, of CRISPR gene editing being used as a form of high-tech conversion practice to try to reduce, if not eliminate altogether, the number of trans people in society, which leads us to kind of two questions. First one is, would it work? And the second is, well, would it be bad? And well, I think the first answer to that is, I don't think it would work. But at the same time, it doesn't matter whether it would. So, there's a long history of searching for the gay gene, the gay brain, the trans gene, the trans brain, sometimes from a very conservative standpoint, where the explicit goal is to prevent, queer and trans people from existing, and sometimes from a more kind of progressive side as demonstrating the biological roots of these forms of life in order to prop them up with scientific legitimacy. The reality is a lot of it is pretty bad science, right? So there's a lot of p-hacking, first of all, especially when we're looking at genetic studies, especially if you're starting looking at especially a high potential p-hacking when you're looking at whole exome research and things like that. But oftentimes people are looking at a crap ton of different genetic markers and are not necessarily adjusting for multiple comparisons. And so there is a risk of spurious associations being found. But even then, there is quite a lot of overlap and variability. Whenever you see a study on trans people's brain is closer to their gender identity, well, yeah, I guess in a sense, but really we're talking about the average measure for different groups, but there is a huge overlap between the measures across groups. So even if the average measure between groups is significantly different, that doesn't mean that you have an individual identification mechanism at hand, because you're still going to have, on any metric, you're going to have cisgender, that is non-trans men, that are closer to the woman average than some cisgender non-trans women. So you have this kind of huge overlap that tends to get erased in discussions of the trans gene or the trans brain. And so in that sense, statistical significance does not necessarily translate into clinical, diagnostic, or even kind of conceptual significance. One example is in one study where they're 37.4% of trans women have this gene, whereas 26.6% of cis men have this gene. And you're well, that's a pretty big, that's 10%. But, if you were to use that as a diagnostic mechanism, well, how do you, differentiate between the cis men and trans women there when there is the vast majority don't have that gene either way? And you can, of course, move to polygenic models where you look at multiple genes, but that's a lot less useful from the perspective of CRISPR, people who want to do high-tech conversion practices. But the reason I said, well, it wouldn't really matter is that even if it doesn't work, that doesn't prevent people from trying, and the first proof of that is the fact that we have countless studies suggesting that conversion practices don't work and suggesting that they're harmful, and people still do them all the time anyway. And so there is a bit of that resistance, which would mean perhaps the best thing to do is to simply stop funding the transgene and trans brain studies because they're a better use of the money. But that's a discussion for perhaps another day or for the discussion period after. But the question then is, well, would it be bad, right? Because it's one thing to say, okay, maybe CRISPR could open the door to high-tech conversion practices. But then the second question is, okay, is that something that we take issue with? And that raises important questions about what it is that makes conversion practices unethical. And oftentimes they are being attacked as for being harmful. So the main argument you will see being deployed in the literature is the argument that conversion practices are deeply, deeply harmful. But here we're talking about the possibility of harmless conversion practices, especially if we're looking at the kind of preventative level, even before birth, because if you're acting at the level of germline cells, if you could reliably identify a transgene, or even just one that significantly increases the chance of the child being trans, then you could change it and potentially have no negative impact on the child, because in effect, you're changing which child you get rather than changing the child that's already there. So would harmless conversion practices be unethical? And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, would say that's actually fine. But I want to push back against that a little bit and suggest that the very use of CRISPR as high-tech conversion practices would perpetuate dehumanizing and degrading ideologies towards all trans people. And so even if you're not necessarily harming the person in front of you, it is harming trans communities writ large, because it's predicated on the idea that there's essentially something wrong about being trans and something undesirable, and that's something we should avoid. And that ties to the immorality of eugenics. In eugenics, yes, there is the issue that there's harm being done to people and there's a denial of rights, but there's also this broader issue of labeling certain lives as undesirable, as disposable, as not worthy of inclusion within civil society and within our image or imagined community that forms the nation, to use a bit more kind of Benedict Anderson type terminology. And so, sure, conversion practices are harm, but it's not just harm, it's also inequality and dehumanization. And in that sense, is harm not just to the individual, but to the very moral fabric of society. So that was kind of my first thread of thinking around CRISPR and trans issues. And then the second thing, I was like, well, what if we want to take things in a more positive mood? Are there benefits that could come from CRISPR for trans communities rather than just bad stuff? And that's where we get to the topic of potentially high-tech medical transition. So medical transition refers to a host of medical technologies, be it like hormonal, be it facial hair removal, be it surgeries, a whole sort of array of medical technologies that are used to help the person reach their embodiment goal and better live out their sense of gender, whatever that means to them. Sometimes framed as a woman transitioning to be a man, or a man transitioning to be a woman, but really it's much more about self-actualization and making your body a home for yourself. And the reality is, like, because bodies are inherently disappointing, as in bodies fundamentally have limitations by virtue of being bodies, then transition will never be perfect enough. It will never do everything we want it to do in the same way that bodies just never do everything we want them to do. They age, they get ill, they they get injured. There's all sorts of things that happen that fall short of what we would really want. And the sort of conceptual distance of CRISPR, tied to the fact that people don't tend to know a whole lot about CRISPR, means that it often feels like the possibilities are endless. It becomes a little bit like a magic wand. CRISPR just becomes this thing that we invoke in order to daydream. And these possibilities sometimes are appealing enough to ignore the voice inside of my head that says, don't play God. And so that brings me to the question of like, well, what could we dream of using it for? And there's some really cool stuff that we could think about. One is, well, I have to take, so as a trans feminine person, I have to take estrogen and progesterone to maintain the body that feels the most at home for me. And, it's not a major inconvenience because I also have to take other medications anyway, but it'd be pretty cool to be able to have endogenous hormonal production. So would we be able to use CRISPR in order to help people have this endogenous hormonal production that's different from the one that their kind of unaltered body would produce on its own? Could we make my body generate estrogen, for instance? It also potentially opens up possibilities for picking and choosing hormonal effects, because some people want some effects, but not others. So I know, for instance, somebody who wanted estrogen, but didn't want breasts. And that's not something you really get to pick, as in you can't prevent the breast development that comes from it. And what made the most sense for this person was to take the estrogen for all the effects that they wanted, and then get a mastectomy to remove the breast tissue, and so kind of get the best of all that they want. But CRISPR could potentially be used to pick and choose hormonal effects by playing on the receptors, for instance, in terms of that. And so that'd be pretty great. Potentially could use CRISPR to prevent visible scarring as well from surgeries, and alter tissue type, which can be a difficulty, especially for genital surgeries. There is some histological changes that occur on their own, but having CRISPR to really kind of change the tissue type altogether would be really cool. And another one, and I think this one is probably one of the more realistic one, is to use CRISPR in order to grow tissue and organs for xenotransplantation. So essentially grow organs outside the body, but use gene editing in order to make it compatible with the person's body, and then use that in surgeries for transplantation and things like that. So this is a pretty big range of potential ideas. Now, what would it actually mean in practice? Well, historically, trans health has been stuck in a very binary mode. And so I think there is a desire that CRISPR could perhaps break us free of these very narrow models of what a man's body should look like and a woman's body should look like. And so you could think about, really kind of customizing what each person wants with the example of pick and choose hormonal effects that would really break open this binary of male and female in society. It could also potentially undermine the binary between cisgender and transgender people, as we would likely see some cisgender people also seek out these bodily modification and customization through through CRISPR. You know, there may be some cisgender women who'd want lower voices, who'd want more facial hair, who'd want larger clitorises. There might be cisgender men who would want softer skin or thinner body hair or different orgasms and things like that. It can also open up imaginaries of what even counts as gender, because, well, take for example the idea, and this is a I mean, you encounter the wildest things on social media sometimes, and you know, and one of them that I've encountered once was this idea that like all cats are girls and all dogs are boys, which is kind of a wild idea, but when you think about it, there is something that is perceived as feminine in felines. Felines are seen as inherently feminine. So, well, what about whiskers? Could people grow whiskers as a mode of kind of gender technology? And if tattoos can be gender expression, that's something that I have, you know, what about bioluminescent breasts, or as in the title of my talk, electric tits? And these are all really big dreams of CRISPR as potentially helping us undo gender, but they're ones that might prove to be very elusive. Theorist Sarah Cohen-Shabbat has written really good papers on the grotesque as a critique of Donna Haraway's cyborg feminism. And the idea of CRISPR is essentially invoking an ideal of the cyborg, of this body that we can technologically construct to do whatever we want. And feminists have long kind of seen cyborgs as a feminist figure, but that was critiqued later on by Sarah Cohen-Shabbat, who suggested that cyborgs can actually become figures of hypergendering rather than figures of destroying gender norms. And really easy examples of that is for people who've seen Terminator, where you have, you know, the T-800 played by Arnold Schwarzenegger being this like very hyper masculine figure, and then you've got the TX played by Kristen Aloken, who is very hyper feminine, very conforming to gender norms and conventional ideals of beauty. And those really give us examples of how cyborg gendering can turn out when left to the whims of prevailing social power structures. And as much as CRISPR may throw wide open the door of possibilities when it comes to medical transition, one thing it doesn't do is fundamentally alter the power of doctors. You know, I personally have little doubt that doctors will pursue the perfection of binary gender categories long before they'll develop technologies that pursue androgyny, gender liberation, and customization. And in many ways, doctors working in trans health have been less committed to promoting the pursuit of individualized individual goals than to promoting normative ideals of masculinity and femininity, ones that are primarily based on white femininity and masculinity. And the risk with that is that CRISPR will just become yet another tool to reinforce the idea that there's something wrong with looking trans, with being visibly trans, and with being visibly gender nonconforming in some way. And that's not a purely theoretical concern, because it's something that we're already seeing with trans youth, where to an extent, youth who want something that's slightly different from full gender conformity are being denied care. And we are seeing a sort of hostility and hesitancy towards offering gender affirming care to those who don't fully fit into this model of, you know, binary man and woman that is gender conforming, that is in essence doesn't look trans and is able to fully blend into society. And of course, some trans people want to blend into society, don't want people to know that they're trans, but there's a lot of other people who mostly just don't want the stigma that comes from society around with that. And so that whole speculative grandiosity around CRISPR, which aligns with the general process of daydreaming of CRISPR's possibilities as a kind of transhumanist, post-human goal, might turn out to be mostly just a story to ourselves, mostly an illusion, and in many ways, potentially the only real benefit that could accrue is redistributive in lowering the cost of medical transition, because CRISPR might end up being relatively cheap in comparison, especially for things like, uh, you know, think, for instance, anti-androgens like spironolactone. Well, if you can act on cells so that they're not receptive to testosterone, then you don't really need the anti-androgen. So that brings us to kind of the ethics of hype and to the question of, okay, but what do we do with these daydreams? What is the significance of these daydreams? Because we are seeing this speculative grandiosity around CRISPR, and now deployed it in the context of trans people, but it's a much bigger topic, and it is borne out primarily out of ignorance and uncertainty. CRISPR seems like a faraway technology, and people don't know what it is actually capable of doing. And I think to a certain extent, even experts don't necessarily know yet what it's capable of doing, but obviously there is still a huge gap between lay understanding, including bioethicists' understanding of CRISPR and the actual possibilities of CRISPR. And these daydreams of undoing gender, or from the perspective of the conversion practitioner, of perfect conversion practices, they aren't benign, is what I want to suggest. And so we must attend to the ethics of hype, because when we are exaggerating possibilities and exaggerating how close we are to achieving them, we are creating hopes and expectations. CRISPR is in some ways the flying cars of today. And when we create these expectations, that actually has an effect on people. For trans people, these hopes, these dreams, this expectation can be life-sustaining, or they can be life-destroying. There are many trans people who have died to suicide from being or feeling unable to reach their embodiment goals. There's a teenager, Lila Alcorn, who wrote a suicide note and heartbreakingly wrote, "I'm never going to transition successfully, even when I move out. I'm never going to be happy with the way I look or sound." And part of that was the sentiment that she had been denied access to puberty blockers, and that had in fact been sent to conversion practices. And so for people like Lila Alcorn, CRISPR could hold a promise, a life-sustaining promise that could kind of keep her going as this kind of horizon where she could in fact be happy with the way she looks and sounds. But on the flip side, these dreams can be potentially life-destroying because of adaptive preferences. If you create an expectation and you have these big expectations and then find that these expectations are disappointed, that can actually cause some people to be suicidal. And that's something that is not entirely uncommon in the, while regret from gender affirming care is relatively rare, among those who do regret, some of them express that part of their issue, part of their regret, is the fact that they were hoping for more, that they were hoping to be able to kind of fully blend into society, and that the current technology didn't allow that, didn't make that possible. And so there is a concern that CRISPR will create expectations that would then lead to disappointment and be a form of psychological injury. That's a hype for the trans people themselves, but there's also a hype for doctors and for parents. These dreams can reinforce normativity instead of forging a path towards liberation. It can really fuel this goal of making trans youth indistinguishable from cis people. Essentially, this goal of erasing trans people from society, not by making them not trans, as conversion practitioners would want, but rather by making visible transness impossible, by making it so that essentially trans people become, in fact, just like everybody else. And there is a problem with that, just like everybody else, if you don't think that society's approach to things is really freeing, is very liberating. Of course, from the perspective of conversion practitioners, it can also reinforce their aims, their long-term goals of eliminating trans people from society, but that can also serve as a justification and as a way of reinforcing their current practices as, you know, being essentially justified. But even on the positive side, there is a certain technocratic naivete in thinking that CRISPR will fix soon enough the problem of transphobia or trans inclusion by making trans people indistinguishable from non-trans people. And that can fuel resistance to current needs. And we have good reason to think that CRISPR can't fix that, not just from a technological standpoint, but also from a social standpoint, because already at present, available technologies are not equally available to everybody. Trans people who have the most access to medical transition are those who are wealthy, those who are white, those who are heterosexual, and those who are better educated, and those who are more gender conforming. There is this kind of model of the proper trans person that is being used in gender affirming care in order to really, well, essentially limit the number of people who are allowed to transition. And oftentimes, I don't think doctors are aware that that's what they're doing, but a lot of the criteria that they use in determining access to care is historically derived from this desire to limit as much as possible the number of trans people out there, and also ensure that they would have patients that would look good publicly, so wouldn't bring any negative attention to their clinical practices. Predicting scientific futures is hard. We still don't have flying cars, and that was a prediction from, you know, way before my time. People already thought we'd have flying cars. Well, still no flying cars, and in that way, technology hasn't really advanced all that much. Well, now we have electric cars, but that's about the big change, right? And so, given how much the psychological and social impact of hype and of hyping technologies like CRISPR, how underexplored that's been, I think we really need to be more prudent when speculating. And that's a call for other people who write on topics like CRISPR, who write on topics of emerging technologies and things like that. I think we need to be more prudent about our discussions. And I think we need to have a bigger discussion about the ethics of hype. Because, you know, and this is going to be my ending word, caught in the daydreams of CRISPR's endless possibilities, we must not forget to fight for a better world. So I'll end this now, and I'll happily take any questions and discussions on the topic of trans bioethics and CRISPR.